Hello?
Hello.
Hi, how are you?
Okay. How are you?
All right.
I'm gonna attempt to have a very small commute, hopefully
Okay.
outside-ish. But I should be able to be here so long.
Okay. Are you gonna do that now or?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm hopefully like I'll be settled in the next 5 to 10 minutes.
Okay.
And then I should have reliable connection at that point. But I should be here for the whole meeting.
Okay.
And I said I would only be make half yesterday, but I think I'll be here for the whole duration, whatever that is.
Okay. Sounds good. Sounds good. Yeah, I don't know who else is going to make it to the meeting today, but so yeah, Amanda's still on vacation, and we have a couple other people who may or may not join us. So
Did we talk? I know I wasn't here at all last week because I was traveling and everything else. Did we talk about Alife last week?
we didn't. We had a little kind of in passing mention of it, but I'll pull up some things this week and talk about it a little bit.
Yeah, I saw a bunch of cool things. I want to learn more about Tom Froze's eruption theory. I know he's been talking about that, and I haven't read anything on it really yet. I think he released something there. I saw some social media about him pushing that forward there. Oh, I released this at Alife.
Right.
Curious about that. From afar, it looked. I saw one of the diagrams, and I was like, kind of what Avery was getting at, but also not. So that's the thing for me to look at eventually.
Yeah, I can go into it. Not maybe after you get settled in there, so we can discuss it a little bit. But
yeah, that would be good. It might be the best way for me to do this. No, I think I can try to do that. I may be able to listen, but I'm probably gonna be mostly muted for the next 10 minutes or so, if that's okay.
Yeah.
I don't know what you want to talk about in the meantime. And I'm not sure, I have a broad updates that I can talk about, and also, I guess I'll put it this way. What are the things I wanted to talk about? I can do a general, what's happening in the lab the last few weeks. I can talk about my history of science-ish project that I want to put together. And there was one other, maybe, I did not finish the mid-year review. But we can talk a little bit about that as we did last week, and that just has to be fleshed out.
Right.
And then one other thing, but that's mostly it for me.
Okay. Hi, Vrushali, how are you? Do you want to talk about, maybe give a short update as to what you've been up to, or hello, Morgan? Yeah, you can just give updates in the Slack or in the chat if you'd like. Yeah. Oh, Vrushali's working on her project. Yes. So yeah, Vrushali's working on her GSOC project. She gave a nice presentation. I think 2 weeks ago now, and it was great. Morgan's doing well. I take it. So yeah, so great. So let's get started. Let me share my screen. So we have a number of things to talk about this week. We have the Artificial Life Conference, which we'll talk about in a little bit because Jesse's in transit. We have some papers. There's a discussion on causality last week that I want to follow up on. So we'll do those things later. Let's talk about the Slack channels. As I've, we continue to return to the Slack channels to look for things that have been posted. So we have, you know, some activity over. We haven't had too much activity this week, but a little bit. So brain organoids, I think we're caught up with that. We have a few papers here. We have a new article on dish brain, which is this paper we read, I think, several months ago now. It's like this culture of neurons that they put a microelectrode array inside of it, and they stimulate it as well. So they have this closed back feedback loop, and they call this dish brain. So this has been done before, but in this paper they're selling it as sort of a new thing. They're able to train it to play Pong, which is a nice game for closed loop feedback. So Pong is a game where you have two bumpers or two paddles on either side of the screen, and you have to keep a ball from going beyond your paddle. So you have two players. They have to return the serve. It's like tennis, and you know that requires tracking. It requires coordination of a one-dimensional control or one-dimensional paddle that you basically control the position of. So this got military funding. Just so people know, this is an article from Morgan posted this. There's also this article on cross-site reproducibility of human cortical organoids reveal consistent cell type composition and architecture. So this is something that we worry about sometimes when we grow organoids or do cell culture more generally. And this is where you have, you want to have like consistent cell type, especially when you're differentiating cells. So you don't want to end up with a lot of heterogeneity in your system. And you can often induce heterogeneity through different culture conditions, different environmental conditions. And sometimes you can even have things like, you know, mutations that can, or, you know, you can have other types of modifications in different cells in the culture. So, you know, when you create a tissue type, or you have cells in a culture that are going to create this tissue type, you know, you want them to be relatively homogeneous. And so this is what they're, you know, this is for reproducibility purposes, but also for other types of purposes as well, for characterization of the cells. So this is cross-site reproducibility. This is where I guess they go across labs. 3 independent research groups generated HCOs, which are these human cortical organoids from one induced pluripotent stem cell line. So they were able to use the same line of cells, the same method, and then characterize this over time. So this is a nice paper on reproducibility, something that isn't like as sexy as dish brain, but it's still, you know, a necessary thing to think about. Then this paper on genetics of human brain development. So this is a paper on brain development and the underlying genetics. So this looks like a pretty big, I mean, I guess that's a review article, so it's not like, you know, there's not a large set of studies here. So this is brain development in humans as achieved through precise spatiotemporal genetic control, the mechanisms of which remain largely elusive. Recently, integration of technical advances in stem cell modeling with genome editing. So they can use stem cell modeling, which means they can have, they can use undifferentiated cells. They can differentiate them to different types of cells. But they can also use genome editing, which means they can remove certain pieces of DNA or put them into the cell. And so you can do this to induce different phenotypes and actually try to establish causative links between genotype and phenotype. So you can actually genotype the cell. You can look at cellular differences. You can look at maybe the contributions of a certain phenotype from the genome. but you can also put pieces in or take pieces out to test the efficacy of a certain stretch of DNA. So, for example, if you make the claim that some gene has an effect on the phenotype, you can knock out part of that DNA and see if it still contributes to the phenotype. If it does, it's either, your hypothesis was wrong about that gene being essential, or something else. Maybe you're not hitting the right section of DNA. So we can get a sense of what stretches of DNA are responsible for or contribute to a certain phenotype. Now, in development, this is interesting because if we have human stem cells, we can then differentiate cells into different cell types. And this, of course, is relevant to development. So here we review our current knowledge of complex genetic regulation of each key step of human brain development through the lens of evolutionary specialization and neurodevelopmental disorders, and highlight the use of human stem cell-derived 2D cultures and 3D brain organoids. So the 2D cultures are culture plates where they have a single layer of gel and they put the cells on that, or 3D brain organoids where they grow them in a gel, in a three-dimensional gel, to investigate human-enriched features and disease mechanisms. So a lot of these studies, why do we want to know all of this? Obviously, we want to know for reasons of characterizing cell phenotypes, but this also has a lot of relevance to disease and other what they call human-enriched features. So this is, there's a lot of technology that goes into this, a lot of next-gen sequencing, and a lot of methodological sort of prowess, a lot of knockout and knockdown experiments, and so forth. So this is a nice paper that kind of reviews a lot of this. There are a lot of advances in genome-wide association studies, or GWAS, that allow us to look at the contributions of genotype to phenotype. But also we have these sequencing technologies that we need to get a good set of sequences in the genome. So they talk about, and then they actually go through brain development, that there are these different cell differentiations or cell type differentiations, especially with respect to the brain. And what they're interested in is cortex, and they're talking about how cells differentiate in cortex during development. And so that's what we have here. This is the key processes of human brain development. This is a nice figure where they have the age, so from 4 PCW to 10 years. So this is before birth, and this is after birth. So before birth, this is not to scale in time, but they give the brain development processes down here, and they show sort of the anatomy up above. So you can see that the anatomy changes radically up until about birth. And then after birth, it's a matter of maturation. And so you have a lot of different processes here that we can characterize: neurulation, neuromigration, and then myelination once the cells are in place, neurogenesis, synapse refinement and circuitry once the neurons are born, neural differentiation and lamination, neuritogenesis, synaptogenesis, and gliogenesis, and those are all right around the time of birth. So this gives us a good account of human development, human neural development from in the womb and then outside the womb. And so this is very important because this is how the connectome gets assembled, basically, during this period. And so there are a lot of important things going on here, and understanding how genes contribute to those phenotypes is really kind of, I guess, the point of this paper and the point of a lot of work that's being done around it. And so this is an example of, these are stepwise processes during human cortical development. So you can see they're kind of showing this. So what this is in cortex, you have 6 layers of cortex. That's the sort of the isocortex or neocortex. And those 6 layers interact. There's communication up and down between the layers. They form cortical columns, which are connected to one another. And those cortical columns then are connected to things like the thalamus and downstream things from the peripheral nervous system and so forth. And so they're showing here is the development of these 6 layers. And I have another figure that I put in a talk from another several years ago where they show kind of the layers as they grow in development. So they start off with, like, I think 2 layers, and then they continue to go to 6 layers. 2 layers is actually the default in other parts of the brain where you have layered tissue. So you have like 2 layers of entorhinal cortex, for example, but 6 layers of neocortex. So you have this expansion in terms of the number of layers. And it's thought that the greater number of layers allows for a lot of sensory processing, a lot of multisensory processing, and things like that. Although in insects do this in what they call a mushroom body, which is different. In any case, this is the developmental trajectory of 6-layered cortex. You go from like this 2-layered system to a 6-layered system, and you can see that that involves cells proliferating and becoming, differentiating into different cell types. And so they're capturing that here. So this is another reason why we want to know the genetics underlying this, because there's a lot of genetics at this stage of development that are putting things in place. So that's brain organoids. I don't think we have any new things in Cognition Futures. I've posted a couple things here. This is a nice paper if you're interested in, and we might talk about this in Cognition Futures, but this is a paper called Metastability Demystified. So this is this notion of dynamical systems and complexity theory and what they call metastability. And we can get into this, like I said, probably in the Cognition Futures group first, and then we'll bring it back to this group because I don't want to get too deeply into it. It's very much connected to what we're doing over there, though, in that group. This paper is really about this idea of metastability in the brain. So metastability was something that originated in statistical physics and dynamical systems. This is a key signature of what they call balance in terms of healthy brain functioning and stable integration between brain areas. So the authors that are on this paper, they've done a lot of work in areas like motor coordination or other areas of cognition. And so this is something that they're kind of building off of their theories from that in those areas and kind of giving a broader sort of framework for the brain. So they provide a comprehensive review of metastability in this paper and applications of neuroscience, covering its scientific and historical foundations and the practical estimators used to estimate it in empirical data. We also provide a critical analysis of recent theoretical developments. So basically, metastability is where you have 2 stable points and you have an unstable point in between, or you have 2 unstable points and a stable point in between. The idea is that the brain needs to stay, in the stable point and not transition to the unstable point. Sometimes people think of this as a saddle point, which you see in H, which is where the system state, and system state is just defined as like a characterization of a state, and they usually put it on a landscape or on a graph. It sits on top of this ridge. You can see that ridge here. This is the saddle. This space looks like a saddle, and this is the saddle point. And so the idea is that the system, when it's stable, sits on top of that saddle point, but it's poised to make a transition to some other state. But it can also transition to unstable states. So this metastable state here, it's at the top of this peak. If you can see my cursor, it can transition down to these unstable states, or it can transition over to this other stable state, which is at an adjacent peak, but has to maybe traverse this unstable region to get there. Now, the question is whether the system is poised well enough to transition into this new stable state, remain in this stable state, or unfortunately, it might degenerate into this unstable state and stay there. And that's when you're not, your brain is not in balance, apparently. So this is, kind of, there's a lot of dynamical systems and complex systems underlying this, or at least the theory. So, like I said, we might return to this later. This will be something for a future Cognition Futures meeting. Then another paper, A Relativistic Theory of Consciousness, which is kind of interesting, but I don't want to get into that right now. I think computational psychiatry has had a few things in it. We always have nice discussions in this area. Morgan posts a lot of things here, different types of studies on mental illness and aging and other things. So that's something to check out if you're interested in computational psychiatry. Something we don't talk about too much. It would be interesting if we could talk about that a little bit more. Maybe Morgan could give a presentation on it or something. That would be nice. One more channel, actually. Well, two more channels. The first is Neuroscience Networks. So we have two network channels. We have a network science channel, which is more generally network science. That's less active, but we also have neuroscience networks. Neuroscience networks is more active, and we have more things on neuroscience networks, things like connectomes or other types of networks. So if you go through here, you'll see a lot of really interesting papers where we kind of talk about networks in different ways. So if you're interested in networks, this is probably the place to join if you're not in already, or pay attention to. So this is, there are a lot of things in here, from AI to this paper here, Network Statistics of the Whole Brain Connectome of Drosophila. This is a nice paper, just came out recently. This is, so what's going on with Drosophila connectome is interesting. If we look at C. elegans connectome, we know that it's like about 302 neurons. And so that was characterized quite a while ago. And a lot of people use that as like the standard small connectome. But what's happened in Drosophila is that Drosophila has a much larger connectome. It has different parts of the brain that are maybe analogous to what we see in mammals or vertebrates. But it's a different brain structure. So there isn't like the same, we don't have cortex and neocortex. We have these nuclei, these centers. And one of them, of course, is the mushroom bodies, which does a lot of things. But what they've done in the Drosophila brain is they've done connectomes piecemeal. So they did the first connectome, I can't remember, I think it was like a motor connectome, and then a sensory connectome. And they've done a couple other connectomes. And now they're kind of bringing those connectomes together. And this is where they're talking about this. So this is the Flywire Initiative, or the Flywire Connectome. And a lot of this work has been done through the Janelia Institute at the NIH. So they've been doing this work with characterizing the Drosophila connectome, building drafts of that connectome, and so forth. So the Flywire project has been completed. We have access to the connectome of a complete adult Drosophila brain containing 130,000 neurons in millions of connections. So this is a huge connectome. It's not the human connectome, but it's a lot bigger than C. elegans. So here we present a statistical summary and data products of the Flywire connectome. They talk about the network properties and topological features, which means that when you have a network, you have different features. You have hubs, which are nodes that are highly connected, versus the rest of the network. You have motifs, which are like triangles. I think we've talked about triangles, but otherwise called simplices. You have modules, things like that. So yeah, to gain insights into local connectivity, we computed the prevalence of 2 and 3 node network motifs, examined their strengths and neurotransmitter compositions, and then compared these topological metrics with wiring diagrams of other animals. So one thing they found in the Drosophila connectome is that it has this what they call rich club of neurons. This is something you see in the C. elegans connectome. It's also something you see in the human connectome in data derived from fMRI studies, where they build networks from the fMRI data. And rich clubs are basically neurons that are highly connected relative to other neurons in the brain. So some neurons will take in a lot of connections from different parts of the brain, or what you might call integrators, as opposed to just being, like a local neuron doing your thing. And so these rich clubs are really important for processing, for long distance communication, for shortening the distance between different areas of the brain, serving as a mediator, and so forth. So these neurons serve as integrators or broadcasters of signals because they're so highly connected. So then they have these, they examine subnetworks based on 78 anatomically defined brain regions. So they have a lot of data here, a very large data set, and this data is freely available. So that's something to check out. And finally, we have the virtual reality and Neurotech channel, which this is different from the Discord that we run on virtual reality and augmented reality. This is more about like neurotech and things like that. But there's also a lot of stuff on virtual reality. So Hussein posted something on an open BCI VR headset that's coming out, or that there's a prototype of. It's basically where they have a VR headset, but they also have a brain recording in here. I think there's probably some sort of, I don't know what kind of sensor they're using for it, but this is an open BCI project. So.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I was going to say, that's almost a step in the direction of some of the cyberpunk stuff I talked about before.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So yeah, that's all right. Yeah, so that's good, and that's all I'm going to talk about the Slack for. That's all my Slack updates. Jesse said +1 to Morgan for presenting on CompSci. Yeah.
Yeah, I would be really interested in kind of knowing more about that space because I don't know a lot about it, and there's a lot of cool stuff there, and I feel like I'm lacking some important context. So that would be a fun thing to talk more about, or make have some kind of just a general like, what is this? What is this space? I don't really know it.
Yeah, I don't think it's a mainstream. I mean, it's an area that's kind of recently evolved. Kind of, you have a lot of times you'll have fields where they want to bring in a new methodology, and it's kind of people have to learn the methodology and then they have to apply it, figure out how to apply it to the field. So it came up at Noidsbridge AI meetup too. You mean the computational psychiatry? Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
That's okay.
Got a little discombobulated as I just sat down here. Yeah, I should be able to talk now. I may not be able to show much on like computer screen, but I can talk at least.
Okay.
It's a little bit of a slow time in general for me right now. I'm actually okay with it, which is refreshing because I'm usually not as okay with it. But Amanda's on vacation, and it's kind of this. I was at a wedding event last weekend and traveling and all this other stuff, and kind of getting that classic August vacation period before things start up again. So there's been no real meetings for Cognition Futures or the Norbert Wiener Reading Group or other stuff. Everything's kind of been on hold, which is okay. I'm on a somewhat personal level, I guess. It's sort of a really nice pause of being able to kind of step away from some stuff and think about what do I want to focus on ahead, and even things like location. Like I'm pretty sure I'll be staying in Boston right now, but it's really tempting to go and try to do some things where like my program is online, but I could go to California if I wanted to, and that's not, it's a somewhat appealing thing to do. But I think for this rest of this year, I'll be where I currently am. To that end, one thing that happened in this area supposedly was like certain meetups around Causality 2023. We've had no coverage of it, and given everything else that's been happening, it ended up being at a really I have looked almost at nothing that happened at that major event. I think we might talk about Alife later, but we'll have to do a review of Causality 2023, which is in Australia this year. It's kind of weird because there's been I was I was intending to host a meetup group here in Boston about it last week, and I guess I did in spirit, but one of the people that someone reached out to me about it, and, I'm going to bring our lab, I'm going to this event, and they never really got back to me. And then someone else who is very enterprising, I think, they messaged everybody on the list for meetups and saying, "Oh, did you have experiences? Like, how did your experience go?" And then it was just, "Hey, well, that's great. Maybe we should compile this and submit it to the Cogsides log, and maybe we'll get posted." So it was kind of a very it was a little weird, all of that, I guess. So I feel like as I'm coming back to the normal ebb and flow of things, I guess I'll say I need to catch up with Cogside stuff. I need to catch up with the Alife stuff, and it's not that far away from Lead Robot, which is the end of September, and then we're at ISPSM. This is the first conference about International Society for Philosophy of Mind virtually, which is, I think, in mid to late November or something like that. So, one second here. There's a lot of that's kind of the broad overview of things. There we go. In a slightly more minutia approach, there's been a couple things that have stood out to me recently, and there's been a really nice. I know they've been a bit unstructured, and I apologize for that, but the Google Storm code meetings and sort of the professional development freestyling I've been doing has been pretty useful in terms of I worry it's a little too useful just for me to recap stuff. And I do want to make it a little more user friendly to interface with it. Maybe just do a small write up recapping the points of what I'm saying. And that's part of why I made a task on the boards about everybody else is documenting other stuff, having a light documentation about the actual things that we are talking about would be good. And that's in line with a lot of other. There's this ongoing project of I don't know, if one is to have an academic blog or some kind of a semi-serious or semi-professional blog space, where's a good place to actually hold that? Because it's been such a mess. It's been such a mess for all the different platform wars, and as I think I said before, Bradley may be the wisest by just making a blog a long time ago on blog posts and letting it be, because I think that's I don't know. There's a lot of there's so much all the new platforms, like I'm looking at Ghost and obviously Substack and things like that, and beyond Medium and outside of Medium, or WordPress sites and all these things. And there's so much pressure to do this, make your blog posts, make your blogs, make your thing a newsletter, make it monetizable, and have your brand. It's make your column for a newspaper kind of a thing, and I don't know. That's inconsequential in one sense, and also kind of important, because as on my mind still are the things we talked about in terms of making a discussion series for the lab. I feel like kind of what we have, in effect, what we're doing with a lot of the professional development discussions and Google Summer of Code. Well, the open source Friday meetings, not just about Google Summer of Code, to be fair. That's basically a really small version of a discussion series. We have 20 minutes to 30 minutes, and maybe a little bit more than that, of here's an idea, here's a story, and then there's discussion between us, and then we have a conclusion. So nothing really concrete, or nothing, I guess, concluded there heavily, but there's absolutely a sense of that's not just empty play. There's a lot of things going on there that I'm trying to sort out in the process of everything else. We had a nice meeting yesterday for Google Summer of Code. I think Vrushali and Raj are kind of back after a bunch of things and pushing forward on the projects, and just trying to steer that ahead a bit more, and think about everything in that context. There's been some also nice papers on writing. I think there's some dovetail, Brad has been sharing things about different kinds of writing or different kinds of reading papers and all this stuff, and communications. And I think there's some. I think one thing we should really put on the ultimate to-do list for the rest of this year is it doesn't have to be that coherent, but there should be something somewhere we can say, here's or at least what has formerly been called the education banner for the lab, and have a way of just talking about what we're doing in these spaces, because there's a lot of constructive things happening there, and there's stuff that's almost in the works, but I feel like that would be a great thing to just get across the edge there. That's on my mind. The other things that I would be interested in talking about are a sort of philosophy of science, history of science project, and excuse me. And there's one other thing that I can't quite remember right now. Basically, Plot Twisters is also on kind of vacation right now, but it will be coming back soon. In the meantime, someone from Plot Twisters, who goes by Y2K, they are considering, they're very interested in like history and philosophy of science outright, which is totally, I would dare say orthogonal, but maybe isn't really the fairest word to say here. Their path on that front isn't shaping my project ideas at all. I have actually very specific reasons for my potential philosophy and history of science project, because I'm kind of I'm trying to do some big time planning for things I want to do down the road. And I realized, like, oh my God, I need to have a little bit better sense of literally the philosophy behind developing scientific knowledge. And I started reading and listening a few things and having a space for that. But also getting a sense of kind of a historical or overview of the way things have been produced, with the way that what has been scientific knowledge has been produced, how it's been disseminated, and just a little bit more understanding of that whole process. And we talk about that here in the lab. It's related to stuff. I think Bradley mentioned somewhere, is it related to the Cognition Futures stuff? Yeah, it totally is. I just find it to be like, as I'm finishing off stuff with the frontier map, I guess preprint or I don't know what to call it, the frontier map implementation space, which is, I want to try to feature that at WeRobot. It's accepted there. As I get that someplace, there's sort of like there's a lot of opportunity to integrate philosophy of science stuff and history of science into frontier map itself. Do you have to know, because it's more of just a tool, and you can imbue the tool with a lot of, I almost feel like you could add a bunch of extensions or plugins if you wanted to the tool, which is a very loose and potentially misleading way of me talking about frontier map. So I don't want that to be too misleading. But I feel like you see this thing and you see, oh, I could add this and this and this and this. It's a bit like, maybe Google Star Code software project, which frontier map isn't really that. But you could see all these different, if I had more time, if I could really imbue this into this, how this is working. But I think the general frontier map is kind of just a very light framework. But that said, working on it and talking about it, and most importantly, there's and this is maybe a discussion I would like to formally have at some point, because I don't yet know how to talk about it. But there's been absolute sort of there's been a lot of background work, or maybe not background, but in the whole process of doing the Cognition Futures stuff and frontier map and the discussion we're having here, and a lot of things around that, including like the Norbert Wiener Media Group. There's been there's a kind of latent or indirect, just maybe it's reasonable to say it's contributing to my desire to make a philosophy or history project or reading group itself. But in terms of doing, and it also bridges into the education banner. But in terms of going through all that stuff over the last year, and not even in a sense, it's quite a different lens than, say, the mid-year report, for example. The mid-year report, if those haven't seen it yet, is just like, hey, what's happened over the last 6 months, or kind of the general themes happening in the lab before we're taking a little bit of a break. That's more, I don't know, relatively marketing material or like publication, public announcements and updates, which is a good thing to have. What I'm getting at here is as I'm thinking about, like, there's something very particular I'm taking away from my time in Cognition Futures, my time with some education stuff on the lab, my time in some curriculum development process in the education space, and even somewhat to the extent of the professional development communications that discussions we have. All of this has kind of really been pointing out to me something to do with the different. I guess in my mind I'm using this language right now to talk about it, which is a little ironic because I'm going to talk about language and literacy, and it's basically this. As someone who's trying to take both an educational role at times and clinical is not the right word, but there's sort of educating, and then there's like education in the here's the theory work that you would develop. The theory, like if you were in a an undergraduate or graduate course, okay, we're going to look at this topic. There's sort of the theory or the intellectual philosophical stuff that's underpinning the discipline's specific foci or interest. And then there's a more practical application of community. Okay, well, how does this affect people that aren't just academics, kind of a thing? It's sort of implementation, but also maybe, and I don't think it's quite the same as making a popular science book or a popular psychology book. It's not quite that, but to an extent it is. So I know I'm dancing on my words a lot. I guess what I'm saying is, through my time with Cognition Futures and everything else, is I guess I'm having a much a strong sense that my sense of perception is evolving about if there is something to become literate in, there's sort of a requisite having a language. You have to have a language, and you have to have things by which the language, they have to have artifacts in the language that can be interpreted or read or digested or consumed. And then sort of the fidelity between the language and things in that language is sort of, there are many factors, but like that's sort of related to literacy. Like you can't be literate in something that doesn't have any artifacts to be literate about, doesn't have any theory, or doesn't have a language about how to describe it. And I feel like, my words about this are very incomplete right now, and I don't have a lot of. I'm searching for a lot of ways to talk about this, but whatever it is, something that I'm coming up with a lot in terms of a lot of the things. I guess it's kind of an evolution. If you, this is, I don't really feel comfortable with this phrasing, but it's a potential lens to view what I'm talking about. Is if Cognition Futures is this project that's sort of ironically named because we're looking at a lot of past stuff and looking also at sort of what's sort of the frontier, what's on the horizon of this. And I feel like that my experience in it has done a very good job of helping me see, okay, like where are the people that are pushing, like what are like the last few papers we looked at, the Raja paper, the other paper, I'm looking at things about, okay, how do we push, how do we reconcile mechanism and like an activism or different aspects of embodiment? How are we going to deal with some of the methodology to deal with pushing aspects of environmental psychology or these more ecological approaches in general? How are we going to like what's the theory that's going to push some of the stuff forward, and why are the limitations about that? I think it's been really useful in that sense to kind of get what the trajectories are, and where work is being done on them. And I guess I would say, I think I'm understanding a bit more now, like the difference between establishing or like pushing one trajectory forward a little bit versus trying to make different actual branches, or like a parallel track that has some connection but is mostly distinct in terms of some of the functioning or some of the theoretical connections. And I guess I don't really know how much to say it much better than that, but I'll kind of pause for comments and feedback and questions so far before I say some of these things. I know there's a lot, but it's like a scribbled journal note right now.
I have some note. I've been taking notes and I've been kind of making points here, so I'll go through them and I'll see. I'll just go through my points and then. So the first thing you did mention a bunch of things coming up, and we need to talk about, like, we need to stay on top of that so we can make the deadlines. I know, like, we get like accepted to something and then we have to produce the output, and sometimes the output is more work than the submission, so but that's so yeah, we'll have We Robot coming in September, so we need to get that done. The Philosophy of Mind conference, that's in November, so we need to, when we bring Cognition Futures back into session in a few weeks, we'll start, maybe we'll just spend a lot of time on that, like maybe a little time each week working on those drafts.
I agree with that.
Yeah. There's Beacon, which is Beacon AI, which is cognitive architecture. That's going to be in October. That should be interesting because it's being hosted in China, and apparently they're having some issues with people being registered, or I don't know. It's like virtual and in person, but anyways, we'll see how I'll I have to produce a talk for that, is the bottom line. I don't know, maybe Ankit wants to be involved in that too. We'll see. And then the Neuromatch conference will also be in November. The Neuromatch conference, I think we can recycle things a bit from some of the other venues that we've done.
Oh, has that been released for a date yet?
No, but it's usually, probably November, right? Like in the fall sometime. So, if it happens, who knows? But the point is, yeah, we have things coming up. We need to work on the products to get them done. So that's going to be, the fall. But we don't have to do that today. We don't have to commit to anything today, like work schedules and things like that. But then, I really enjoy your professional development features in the open source meetings. I think those are very useful, especially with respect to the students. We don't do it. We have two other GSOC scholars in DevoWorm. I don't know if they're getting exposed to that as well, but I think it's very valuable though to have that, and I would encourage you to work those out. Like, we can revisit the ones that you've done, and you can work them out into more formal materials if you want. I think they're very good though. They're very good because they get into some of the real life sort of details of managing your professional interactions. So it's not things that you would think about going in. Like you say, well, what do I need to think about in terms of developing my skill set? There might be specific skills or specific courses you could take, but this is like, these are things that have actually happened. This is how you navigate them. And this last week in open source in that meeting, and then 2 weeks ago we went through some readings. I collect readings on different how-to things or practice-related things. Like this was for writing a technical paper, or how to sort of understand like how to approach scientific research and development, scientifically oriented research and development. And so there are a lot of strategies people have kind of developed. A lot of those go undiscussed. Like, you'll go to, like, you'll work in a lab or you'll work in a research group, and they'll have a certain perspective on discovery that's not obvious. So some of the papers we discussed in the session were like working from ignorance or working from chaos. Those are specific approaches that people take. Sometimes people take very conservative approaches to research and development. So you were going to say something.
Oh, just yes. I don't want to interrupt your flow, but I was just saying yes. Yes to the lack of discussion and kind of lack of context, especially for early career people that it's in that space.
Yeah. Yes, I think we should, maybe formalize some of this more too. And this is, we're developing these things kind of as we go along. We're figuring out kind of what's needed or what can be done in, like, bite-sized amounts. So we don't want to give people like this huge torrent of informational at once. We want to break them down into lessons. And I think incorporating the meetings is good. So that should be good. The philosophy of history of science thing, I like that. You have to find the right person for it. Obviously, we have been incorporating some philosophy into the lab. And then, like, I like this observation you have of taking Cognition Futures and, saying, well, it says futures, but it's really about the past too. So we have these, we have to understand the history of like a field to understand the future, where it's going.
Well, and to be fair, like, I'm a little bit of behind the curtain on all of that. Like, I think I have. I'm really fortunate. Like, what the most some of the most exciting things you get is like when you start. I feel like I've changed my field of interest a lot during my life, and I'm very okay with that. Like, I remember when I first, before I settled on one of my early like majors in college was like international relations, or sort of like global economy stuff. And I was like, oh, geez, how am I ever going to understand all this world history? Because it keeps changing all the time and all these different nuanced things about it. And in reality, that's just the view at the beginning. In reality, especially in world affairs, history is pretty, in the words of, I think, Norbert, like, it's a very particular kind of devil or challenge in that historically, the past isn't really changing very fast. However, the interpretations and who you talk to and their perspective about what things mean, and is maybe more for debate. But you acclimate after a couple of years. You have much different bearings after 2 years or 3 years than you did when you first start really taking a field seriously. I feel like, I don't know if it's fair of me to say for cognitive science right now, but I've definitely spent at least a year or two in the scale of screw around and find out. Like, I've done a lot of just trying, like, intentionally, investigating some things. The merit of them is what it is. And I guess what I'm getting at with this part of it is that there's some major things that I'm really I think I'm understanding slowly, and I'm not going to say too much here because I want to be very careful how I go into this. But there's just major things that I really disagree with about the structure of what was cognitive science as a project. And I wonder, like, I'm currently wondering how much I disagree with them in terms of some other aspects of philosophy in general. And it's sort of like, the thing is, I don't particularly desire to be radical. I don't want to be, write a bunch of polemics about why this is super wrong and this and that. And I feel like there is an important place for society or academia to be the gadfly, to be the critic, to just bother other people. Like you could say Gary Marcus on AI. Like that's a role that I don't think is a terrible role to have. Or other people on like longevity or the developments or futuristic things. It's much more, I don't know. I guess I want to balance my criticism and my sense of what I would want to do differently or how I want to push things differently with a very strong respect for why, like, there's reasons things went the way that they did, for better or worse. And I feel an immense, I think earlier in life, I was a little more intentionally, I don't know, controversial or polemic about some things. And I have no real desire to be that way right now. But at the same time, I feel like there's certain things that have to be, I guess this is, excuse me. I'll just say this and then we can kind of start wrapping up the discussion about this, which isn't, well, I'll say when we're thinking about the philosophy and history part. But just the general commentary about that trajectory of Cognition Futures for me is basically, I'm getting to a point in my views of everything where there must be a more accessible, and I don't necessarily mean public audience, but like there has to be a better way of modeling some things. And some of it can be bridged from the existing branches, whether it's, the big old debate about reductionism and are you going away from the Cartesian duality and all this stuff. Yeah, that's great. And you have this sort of timeless sort of main quest vibe about that discussion and other things. But also some things I feel like there really needs to be, like right now, there should be much better ways of talking about things that are happening right now in non-esoteric terms in people's lives, but also just in the theories and the models that we have now. And I'm realizing, okay, some of it is that, yes, human beings are not good at talking about this. Some of it is, yes, it's really, really hard to make models in theory that's good. And some of it is simply that it doesn't exist and has not been made. And I feel like that's been the fruit of a lot of the last couple of years, is like, it's just not there. Nobody's really doing it. And it's not that people haven't thought about it. It's just that there's no real graspable infrastructure to it. And my inherent counter argument voice that I hear to this is, well, Jess, of course, that's why it's really hard to do. A lot of people are making these initiatives where they're making their own, free energy principle is a major thing, but everybody has their own. It's not unusual for them to have their spin-off ideas that are remixes and yes, and those aren't going to be mainstream and nobody's going to talk about them. Yes, I think that's a very fair point to make, but at the same time, I'm kind of relishing my impatience or sense of urgency, as I think it will inspire me to do things that I want to do, even if it's a slightly misguided dissertation that I do in a PhD program, hopefully in the future. I'm kind of getting more comfortable with what that is and just what do I do with that. So that's enough of a, I don't know, preview or tease about that. Which is I say that with some irony towards myself, because it's actually, I have a lot of very, 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 very serious thoughts, and a lot of my close friends have been hearing them about it. And I was shout out to those people that will listen to your uninvited talks at them about it. And I guess I will conclude all this and kind of, pass the mic over after saying, to be much more concrete and much more, just to do another pass on the history or philosophy of science. As you can tell, I have some other objectives outside of that project that I'd like to connect that project to, which I just mentioned. But I really think finding a nice, I would love to make, for the lab specifically, for example, I don't know where I want to host the project, because I'm thinking about kind of having it be it's very Joe Pro related to me. So I'm finding a way to host or talk about it. But this is at the very least having a kind of established curriculum and a kind of set of thinking about borrowing a little bit from the Cognition Futures project right now, having a little bit of a prescriptive versus a descriptive glossary kind of a vibe of what do these terms mean, and maybe in a lab how are we as an interdisciplinary lab cross-studying along different fields, how are we going to I don't think we need to publish orthogonal labs our manifesto and our standards that we want everybody to use all the time for talking about theory, philosophy of science stuff. No, but I think having a little bit of almost like making an internal course might be really useful for people, because I'm starting to get a little bit into the nitty gritty of, how do you relate facts to a theory, and what does induction say about that? What are the conditions that you need to have to go from this the structure and nature of those arguments from a philosophical lens, and just getting a little bit more literacy in that might be a really great thing to do for me. And I think there's ways that can improve the lab and other stuff too. Not that I really want to focus on it too much, but I feel like there's it's like there's a word for it that's escaping, the opposite of collateral damage. As you're moving in a direction, you can say, oh, I'm moving this way and it's great, I want to go here, and there's a nice low-hanging fruit along the way I'm going to pick and take with me and share, because it's right there as I'm passing by. That kind of thing. So I'll leave it at that, and if you have any other questions or comments, again, much more talk about this ahead. So.
Yeah, I mean, this is great. This needs obviously more detail and to ground it more in actual cognitive science. But yeah, I kind of get I kind of see where you're going with this. This is great. And then this is, of course, when you talked about frontier maps, you talked about plugging things in. So this is like specific approaches or specific. I wasn't quite.
Part of the thing with frontier map, at the end of the day, I'm trying to adjust a bit of the scope and how I present what frontier map is at its sort of core functioning, because to me it's basically, here's some things you can do. Here's a way to do a few different guided or targeted searches. And then what do you do with the things you find on that search, and kind of ways to discuss those points or put them in a database or something like that. That's, in the most simplest form, that's probably what frontier map functionally is. However, you could totally imbue a lens of, I say, I don't think frontier map is a literature review. It's different than that to me. But you could absolutely make a literature review from it. You could make entity bibliography from it if you chose to do it, or at least it could be a auxiliary tool to making those more traditional things happen. Similarly, you could deeply go into the theory and philosophy of science and say, well, you could get really deep in the weeds and saying, you could target what you're searching for in those ways and say, well, you know, you could really focus on methodology. You could really focus on some of like the figures of the landmarks and say, I really want to look at this from the level of what did this school of thought try to do over time? Like, there's different ways you could tailor it and pick these things out. And I feel like I think what I want to try to do is present that as these are things you can do, but I don't want to say a frontier map is you have to become an expert in the philosophy and history of science to do a frontier map properly. And if you don't know all these terminologies, you don't have all this context, you don't know, all the different layers and the different parts of Kuhn's revolution cycle, then you're not doing a frontier map. That kind of a thing. Like how much extra stuff do I want to make mandatory or like this is bonus material kind of a deal.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to mention before we move on is this. I think we might need to have, or maybe it would be nice to have, this sort of meetup framework, so we could like have at least the way I wrote it down here in my notes. Local reprocessing of virtual conference content. So it's like, you have a virtual conference, you have these meetups, or it could even be virtual lab-specific groups or groups of people, across labs or whatever, who reprocess the content. So, you see all the content, and there's usually much more than any one person can digest. And it's just a way to digest that and say,
yeah.
Because I think they have these meetups. I think
that would be great.
Yeah. I think they have these meetups, but they don't really know why they do it. It's just kind of like, oh yeah, hi,
and there's two things that immediately jump out to me from that, and one is that yes, reprocessing, and two, doing them after the event happens is pretty cool too. Like a lot of meetups, a lot of things like for Cox, like yes, be a part of it, which I get it, but also like it's almost like after the big holiday sale, go the next day, get it on sale, and it's there. But it's more like I would love to get a group of people together to say, hey, we're going to all look at, even if everybody looks at 2 or 3 papers or presentations that just says wrapped, like just let's have a freestyle 40-minute session talking about all that stuff. I think that would be huge, and also be a good part of our discussion series too. I don't know if that's what you were getting at in terms of. Were you suggesting making like a template for like let's like, I don't know if this is what you meant, but like, okay, for Alife or for orthogonal lab, what do we do about that? Okay, we'll make a template saying, okay, here let's like create this, I don't know, task or project where we look. It's kind of what we tried to do with the Cogsi review 25th anniversary, right? It's like we look at. Everybody looks at some stuff, we talk about it, and maybe we make a blog post about it or something. And it's a way to a little more. It's basically like an applied journal club to an event. Is that kind of what you're getting at, or what did you have in mind? Well, I'm sorry to jump so much into that.
I think so. It could be done that way. It could also be done where you find things that are interesting to the group, or people present on things that were interesting to them. And you have we've done these shared notes documents in the past, where if you're attending a virtual conference, you take what's interesting to you, you put it in there, and there's this very big document that has stuff in it. It's like your notes. You take what's interesting to you and put them together, and then you have this collective thing. And it's not just like, it's kind of like experiencing the content of the conference through maybe different people's eyes, but it's not just kind of like throwing it at someone, or there's some benefit there. There's some process, I guess, reprocessing of the content, and you could do like a journal club aspect to it too. you could take that topic and explore it more. And that would actually be useful because, what is it that's really relevant to our group or a group of people in terms of the content there? What are they actually learning from the content? Not everything is useful to everyone, but
Right.
it is like if it resonates with me, it may not resonate with you, but you might benefit from my thoughts on it. And so, yeah, stuff like that. Yeah, I really don't know if there's a template involved. It's just kind of like, I guess we do have the shared notes documents, and we do have this idea, we haven't done it yet, of, doing like reviewing materials like papers, but in a more reflexive mode where we more actively solicit people's engagement with so one person would review it for 10 minutes and then other people would respond and that sort of thing. But I think that's useful because a lot of times they'll say, well, there's a meetup and the meetup is largely social, which is fine, except that it's related to a conference. I guess I could have met you through like the conference board or whatever, and I don't know. I just think it can be much more useful than what it is, which is, and meeting up with people is fine, but if you don't have anything in common with them, it's kind of like, what's the point?
Well, yeah, right. I had originally hoped to basically have people meet up and have like a whiteboard talk about stuff because that's like my idea of talking to time. But
yeah, you have to build. I guess you have to build bonds with people too. Like a bunch of people come to a thing and then they just say, "Well, this dude's like writing on his board." Okay, it's cool or it's not. I don't know. It's like I don't know people. I meet them for the first time. We're gonna do this thing. I think like events like what I'm talking about maybe give a little bit more of a bond with people, which you can carry on to later endeavors. That's what I'm thinking. Like just knowing how these things work and how collaborations are built and
if I didn't have some other things come up that were very serious I had to deal with for CogSci, I really would have loved it. Maybe I'm underselling this. I would have loved to just meet. One of the things I failed to do somewhat is like meet like the psychology cognitive science people here in Boston, and just connect with them and have a means to do that. It's kind of tough right now. Like I'm fairly social media savvy, I would say, but there's like it's not really like, oh, go to your Facebook groups or use this Twitter hashtag anymore. Like there really isn't. It's a little hard to find, and maybe I should do it more. But yeah, absolutely, I would like to do that, and also just, there's something for, I don't know. I guess I'll say what would you like to do? Were you kind of just talking generally, or would you like to do that? Would you like to apply this to a specific event that in your mind, on your mind, I guess?
Well, we might try that. We might pilot this at this year's Neuromatch conference. So if we can, once we know when it is, we can think about like how to roll this out, at least one version of it. So that's where you have a virtual conference, but you have local involvement. It's not just like everything isn't relevant to everyone. We'll have our presentations of our own, but we'll also want to digest some of what's in the conference, and so we'll come up with a way to do that. Especially since it's all over the world, like you have different time zones, and which is another thing that you have to factor in that there are presentations for different time zones. People are in different time zones, and
I would also say, and I don't know if this will happen this year, and I don't really know where and how it would be, but it'd be fun to do. It'd be fun to aim towards some kind of a. I got a bunch of notifications or like memories or whatever from last year. There was a sort of a Chicago meetup of the lab, which is a great thing. About a year ago in July, and doing something like that again would be good too. I don't really know when or where or how, but we'll keep that in mind over the next several months, I suppose.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, so a lot of great stuff. Thank you for the updates. Again, let's keep on top of the submissions and make sure that people are getting things done. I mean, it's just kind of hard to coordinate it. And then when you have multiple deadlines, it's even worse. So
I'm also curious, like, I feel like I'm a little, as submissions, and I'm not going to pull up the Notion right now, but also like the new things that are, I feel like I feel like it's this weird, like it gives me a little bit of apprehension, or maybe anxiety is a fair word, because there's stuff that submissions are going to be opening up to, like that will happen also later this year, or the start of next year, or even mid-year next year, and I feel like I don't really know what they are. So something to note and to come back to is like, let's pick some of our targets for like the second half of the year, like for submissions as well. Not yes, obviously completing things we have currently is a priority. But there, I feel like there's stuff that I'm missing, and I'm getting a little like, I can't figure out what it is, so I want to sort that out later. But that's all for me. Body stuff.
All right, great. So I'm going to talk about two things the rest of the meeting. One is the Alife conference and some associated things, and then another is to follow up on the causality stuff that we talked about last week. Last week we did do, and Morgan was here, but Jesse wasn't, and I think a lot of people would benefit from, like, if we talk more about causality, actually. Last week we talked about causality as like this, like the sort of the methods of causality and what it is. We went from statistics to machine learning to other areas where people are using causality. This time I want to talk more specifically about neuroscience and about animal behavior and about like behavior in general. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. Let me share my screen. So the first thing is that the Artificial Life Conference happened, I think, last week. This was live in Japan, in Sapporo, Japan, but it was also virtual. So, but of course, the virtual component was, on Japanese time. So for North America, that would be like basically AM would be PM. So that means that a lot of it was like overnight. So it wasn't optimal for people in North America, but often when we have conferences in North America, if they're virtual, people in East Asia can't necessarily join in because they have the same problem. So it's just, again, with these time zone differences. And this is why, it's important to have the virtual component be sort of, maybe recorded and then digested by the groups in question, or people will watch, different people will be responsible for different parts of the conference, and you can bring things together, bring people's perspectives together like that. So this is Alife 2023. The proceedings, I'll go over those in a little bit. And it was a pretty interesting conference. The theme was Ghost in the Machine. So we talked about this. So we actually submitted some things that didn't get accepted, but one of the was an essay on Ghosts in the Machine. I want to revisit that. They didn't necessarily like the way we approached it, so whatever. But it was a pretty interesting conference. I just got I attended vicariously. So this is the proceedings here. So there were a lot of topics that were explored. They did a lot of stuff on neurocellular automata, which I'm happy to see because this is something we've been talking about in DevaWorm a lot in the last 2 years. But there's a lot of stuff going on with neurocellular automata and some of the flow Lenia stuff. So there's this platform Lenia that we've talked about recently in DevaWorm, where they're doing a lot of stuff with like sort of continuous cellular automata. So we think of a cellular automata as like a grid, which is a discrete system. You have these more continuous systems that people are working on. There were a lot of things about hybrid systems, like single cells or different types of artificial cells. Daphnia, which is a water flea, which is in biophysics a very common experimental model. So there was some of that. Can artificial visual signals extend fish's perception fields? So we had work like that. We had artificial neural microcircuits for use in neuromorphic system design. We had some things on DNA circuits. They had a lot of things on so artificial life is generally meant like computer programs, but there's been an increasing amount of bioengineering in the proceedings. So that's interesting. There are a lot of like niche topics in computation, like minimum equivalence and random Boolean networks. Have computations in cellular automata and their application of reservoir computing. Then there are a lot of things about fitness functions and things like that, which are relevant to computational evolution or evolutionary computation. And this is all like aside from the main theme, which was this ghost in the machine. So yeah, degeneracy of control architectures and cell lineages. This is an interesting paper with respect to DevaWorm. Yeah, synthetic minimal cells, things like that. Spatial embedding of edges in a synaptic generative model of C. elegans. Oh, this is Eduardo Izquierdo, who's actually worked with OpenWorm a bit. This is interesting. This is going to be a paper on the connectome in C. elegans and how it relates to behavior. Yeah, so, and then there's always this component of immersive art. So, they always have like an art session where people are building like generative art that is lifelike. They've been doing this for years and years. So there's this focus on generative AI and how it can make art. But they've been doing this in the artificial life community for decades. These sort of immersive art experiences and things like that. Yeah, so there's a lot of interesting stuff. I want to get down to the Ghost in the Machine aspect. There actually was a workshop, Ghost in the Machine, and I think I don't know if I have any, I don't have any screenshots of that, but there are some screenshots floating around social media of this Ghost in the Machine workshop, but they did have a workshop on it. And what they mean by Ghost in the Machine is basically where you have this unknown thing, this demon or this unknown process that guides behavior, guides the sort of the cognition of the agent. And so we want to find out what that is. It's a black box or a gray box, as they call it in cybernetics, but we want to understand that better. So that's what they're getting at, and they're trying to understand that a little bit more through artificial life and this sort of thing. So I don't know where we want to go with this outside of like just perusing the conference proceedings. I think there are a couple of interesting sessions here. There was the agent-based modeling of human behavior. That was an agent-based modeling special session. There was also playfulness in living systems. There was values in artificial agency. A Life in Society, which is a perennial favorite, and then the general conference. So these are all the things that are published in the conference proceedings. So let's see, we have a comment here. Shout out to Maxwell and von Forrester. Okay. Yeah, so this is great. This is a great towards cultures of rhythm and legged robots. This is interesting. So there's just a lot of interesting stuff here. We should look through this more. Like I said, this is exactly the type of thing we want to do with this curation or this sort of reprocessing of content. You know, if we could reprocess some of this content into things that we're interested in, that would be great.
So I have an idea.
Yeah.
And I don't know how it would fit with this, but it's kind of related to Ghost in the Machine in, well, almost in a more flipped around sense. So I know I'm social media friends, which I don't really know what to call that as, with someone who basically identifies as like a robot anthropologist.
Okay.
And she's actually she's kind of based in Korea, but does other areas. And it'd be really interesting to, I don't think she's attended this conference, but she was at like the Robot World Cup and documents a lot of things about people using like actually people using and building robots. So it might be interesting to, I think she's a grad student currently. It'd be interesting to kind of solicit, or I don't know. I think there's something there where it could be like a discussion, or like, I don't know, invite them to speak here or something along these lines. It's not quite the same as Ghost in the Machine,
Right.
but hearing this, like, it made me think quite a bit about like the kind of people that we talk about this stuff. I would love to have to be a little bit more concrete, or what's a word that's about like to addressing the present moment, the present discussion, as opposed to a sequitur or a tangent. To be non-tangential.
Okay.
I would really like to go through maybe even that whole workshop, or like have a specific. I would like to look at more of those things and talk about them more, because I feel like I didn't get to do anything with Alife. I kind of missed on Alife in both Cogsci for a bunch of different reasons in my life, and I would like to do a deeper dive in those areas for sure.
Yeah. So if people are interested in maybe like a higher level view of Alife, there is ISAL, which is the sponsoring organization of Artificial Life. They have a YouTube channel, and I don't know if they have a link off of it here, but they have a YouTube channel where they had some really good summary videos. So it was like they had, they were, I think this is related to the conference. So they brought in a bunch of speakers, and they had like a little encapsulation of their work. And so it just kind of, it's a nice overview, very simple overview of what some of these researchers are doing. And it's at a much higher level than some of the papers that you might read in the proceedings. So, I mean, if you want to read I would encourage you to read the papers and the proceedings. But if you're interested in like, a overview of some of the researchers and what they're doing, and I'm thinking specifically of some of our research interns where, they want to know like kind of how to approach this in terms of research, not necessarily the finished product, but like, how do you pose these research questions? It's just I don't have a link for you, but if you look up ISAL on YouTube, ISAL, they have an organization. It's International Society for Artificial Life, and that will give you the links to that. So they have some sort of YouTube channel for that. But then I don't know if some of these talks are online on YouTube, but that would be nice if they were. So I mean, I don't know if we want to go through any more on the proceedings, but there's a lot here. So there's There are all sorts of things, and the proceedings don't seem to be organized by topic. It's just kind of like things are in here. So there's like Bayesian ghosts in a machine. That was a specific one for the ghost in the machine theme. And so the way they're approaching this is we informally summarize our research work on Bayesian reasoners and agents. We also briefly sketch its relation to an existing and active definition of agents. So there was a lot of stuff on activism, a lot of stuff on some of these other topics that we talk about in Cognition Futures, but also in like DevoWorm and things like that. So I'm going to move on to some of a couple of papers related to Alife research. They weren't necessarily featured at the conference, but this first one is Omni, and this is open-endedness via models of human notions of interestingness. And this is a relatively recent paper, 2nd of June, 2023. This is Ken Stanley, Joe Lehman, Jeff Clune. So these are people who've done a lot of stuff with evolutionary algorithms, and Joe Lehman's done a lot of work on creativity in evolutionary algorithms. So this is like a nice sort of extension of that kind of work. Open-endedness, we've talked about open-endedness is sort of this class of algorithms that kind of comes out of evolutionary algorithms. They're generative algorithms that allow that don't require an agent to have a fixed sort of goal. It just kind of evolves open-endedly. So the abstract reads, open-ended algorithms aim to learn new interesting behaviors forever. So they don't necessarily have a target goal. They just explore their world. They go towards optimum. And, they'll go towards an optimum. They'll go towards another optimum. And they evolve much like we see in the tree of life, where we see lineages diversify. We see different niches occupied. And that sort of behavior is the outcome of open-ended evolution. There's a workshop in open-ended evolution usually every year at Alife, so I didn't see that in the proceedings, but they usually do have an accompanying session. So this is a new sentence that requires a vast environment search space, but there are thus infinitely many possible tasks. So you have to, for open-ended evolution to sort of be efficacious, you need to be able to have this space of possibilities in front of you. You need to have, in other words, have a large search space. And you can have a lot of possible things that you can move towards. Now, you don't necessarily move towards just anything. Usually the options in front of you have different sort of payoffs, or they have different sort of fitnesses or whatever. And so the agent will tend to go towards those things. But the point of this is that the agent does not move towards sort of a fixed goal. So when we think about cognition, or we think about some sort of task in like a psychology experiment, there's usually a goal, and we're measuring towards a goal. It's like, pay attention to this thing, or, maybe like find food or something like that. Now, it doesn't mean that if you're just finding food, that it can't be open-ended. Because it can, because you have to find food in many different contexts sometimes, or you have to get resources in many different contexts. But that's not the way we usually structure inquiry into it. So, there's goal-directed, and then there's open-ended. I wouldn't necessarily make this into like a dichotomy, but it would be interesting to think about open-endedness in terms of goal-directedness. But anyways, back to this paper. Even after filtering for tasks the current agent can learn, which they define as learning progress, countless learnable yet uninteresting tasks remain. So these are minor variations of previously learned tasks. So, when you explore your world and you learn how to do something, there are a lot of maybe learnable yet uninteresting tasks that you can learn that are related to that. So, for example, if I'm learning, maybe like you're learning about things in a new field, you don't learn everything in that field. You just learn maybe what you need to know, or you learn the basics. You learn the framework for things, and then there are things outside of that that are maybe not very interesting, but are learnable. So you've gone down the path of wanting to learn about, say, physics, and you pick like complexity theory as a area, and that may lead you into Alife, artificial life. And so you're learning about these things. You're taking a certain path, and you're learning about basically a certain approach. Maybe someone teaches you, and then there are other areas around it. If you look through the proceedings for Alife, you'll see that there are a lot of different sub areas, subfields that connect in different ways. You don't necessarily take those turnoffs from the main path, but you can, because you now know sort of how this field operates. You know the rules, you know the language, but you don't necessarily, you have to learn those things independently. So the idea is that you can take a path and you can learn things, but they're things that are minor variations of previously learned tasks that you don't learn directly, but you can still learn them. Another thing here, that kind of speaks to generalization of learning, because you learn sort of in a general way, but you don't learn specific tasks. You just learn the general theme. So if you know how to ride a bicycle, you have a combination of motor skills and other things, but you also, you can learn things that are related to that. So this is interesting. An Achilles heel of open-endedness research, which is a field, the Achilles heel of this research is the inability to quantify and thus prioritize tasks that are not just learnable, but also interesting, which is worthwhile and novel. So there are a lot of tasks that aren't really that interesting to learn. A lot of skills. We could talk about like research skills. There's some research skills that are extremely boring and maybe not worth learning even, because we could automate them. But that's something that we need to understand. We propose solving this problem by open-endedness via models of human notions of interestingness, or what they call omni. The insight is that we could utilize large language models, or LMs, I guess they're LLMs, but they call them LMs, as a model of interestingness, which is this MOI, because they already internalize human concepts of interestingness from training on vast amounts of human-generated data. So this is where they kind of get it. They're using large language models that learn a bunch of things from data. Those things, some of them are very interesting, some of them are not so interesting. But this is where we're going to operate from. So what they sort of point out that humans naturally write about what they find interesting or boring. So when you learn about when you train a model on a corpus, it has a lot of things in it, but those things are biased towards what is maybe interesting or boring. So people don't write about everyday tasks. They don't usually write. If they write a biography of someone, for example, they just write about like the interesting things in their lives. They don't write about that they had breakfast every morning and that their breakfast had, this is what they had for breakfast. Unless it was like, something really interesting. They don't. It usually doesn't come up in the corpus. So we're actually biasing our data set in that way, and so we already know that like those pieces, those interesting things are in the data set already. We show that LLM model-based MOIs improve open-ended learning by focusing on tasks that are both learnable and interesting, outperforming baselines based on uniform task sampling or learning progress alone. This approach has the potential to dramatically advance the ability to intelligently select what tasks to focus on next, or what they call in the field of machine learning autocurricula. So autocurricula is this, we've talked about this in the past. This is where the algorithm is teaching itself how to learn. And so it's focusing on these interesting things, what's learnable and interesting, so not just learnable, but also something that should be interesting. That, it's sort of like attention, the way they approach attention in machine learning. It's like you pick features that are the most salient. In this case, you're picking things that are most interesting, and you're using that. And that's the autocurricular sort of criterion. This could be seen as AI selecting its own next task to learn, facilitating self-improvement AI and AI generating algorithms. So this is a nice paper, talks about some of these things, and how we can guide learning in different ways. So I'm not going to get into the paper itself, but I'll talk about this other paper as sort of a complement to this. And this paper is from a group. This is from Min Hassani, who's been involved in OpenWorm. And he does a lot of stuff, interesting stuff with different types of algorithms. They've worked on different sort of liquid state machines and things like that in the past. So they do a lot of really interesting work. And so let's talk about this for a bit. This paper is called Closed Form Continuous Time Neural Networks. So this isn't directly related to Alife, but it's got this sort of this general sort of in the same direction. So let's talk about this abstract. Continuous time neural networks are a class of machine learning systems that can tackle representation learning on spatiotemporal decision-making tasks. These models are typically represented by continuous differential equations. So this is the thing where they're talking about continuous time neural networks. These are continuous systems. They're neural networks. You can use continuous differential equations to represent these models. And this is usually the way people do this. However, their expressive power when they are deployed on computers is bottlenecked by numerical differential equation solvers. So the problem is there's this idea in machine learning of expressivity, meaning that when you pick a certain algorithm or you pick a certain way to represent a problem, it has to be expressive. It has to allow you to do the computations and produce results. Sometimes things are not as expressive as others. So some types of representations are not very expressive. Sometimes this has to do with the ability to solve for X, which is what they're talking about here. Your differential equation solvers, are adequate, but they're not as good as maybe some other methods, such as like an algorithm that, analyze, like a deep learning algorithm. So these are things that, we have to consider when we're thinking about using a certain type of representation as a model. How expressive is it? Can it produce solutions for things in the world? So this is a thing that we don't talk about too much. Actually, in the field of graph neural networks, they talk about it all the time, expressivity. This limitation has notably slowed down the scaling and understanding of numerous natural physical phenomena, such as the dynamics of nervous systems. So we can't model the dynamics of nervous systems using differential equation solvers, as well as maybe we can model them using artificial neural networks. But of course, artificial neural networks are not good, necessarily always good models for nervous systems. So we have to consider these things in the way that. So ideally, we would circumvent this bottleneck by solving the given dynamical system in closed form. This is known to be intractable in general. So this is not a solution. We want to have an open dynamical system for a number of reasons. Here we show that it is possible to closely approximate the interaction between neurons and synapses, the building blocks of natural and artificial neural networks. So where neurons are the units in a neural network, the synapses are the connections. Those are also hold true in the biological system. We want to be able to approximate their interaction, but that requires a lot of computation. And this is, of course, can be constructed by liquid time constant networks efficiently in closed form. So what they're doing is they're saying we can simulate these interactions between neurons and synapses. We can do this with like a neural network, but we can do it better with continuous differential equations because we're interested in the continuous aspect, not just the discrete aspect. But we can't necessarily simulate that because it's an intractable problem in general, because there's this bottleneck, this computational bottleneck, and those models aren't expressive. So we need to have a different model. We need to have, so what they've chosen here is this liquid time constant network. And so this is something that they can solve efficiently in enclosed form. So it doesn't rely on the differential equation solvers or any of that. To this end, we compute a tightly bounded approximation of the solution of an integral appearing in liquid time constant dynamics that has no known closed form solution so far. This closed form solution impacts the design of continuous time and continuous depth neural models. So this is just, continuous time and continuous depth are terms they use. I'm not going to go through the whole paper. I'm just going to kind of give you this teaser, and then if you're interested, you can read the paper later. But basically, they're able to they're able to build a workable model out of this. For instance, since time appears explicitly in closed form, the formulation relaxes the need for complex numerical solvers. So this is where you can take advantage of some of the features of this model to further your success in simulating this system. Consequently, we obtain models that are between 1 and 5 orders of magnitude faster in training and inference compared with differential equation-based counterparts. More importantly, in contrast to ordinary differential equation-based continuous networks, closed-form networks can scale remarkably well compared with other deep learning instances. Lastly, as these models are derived from liquid networks, which is a type of network we won't define right now, but they show good performance in time series modeling compared with advanced recurrent neural network models. So your standard is the RNN, which is usually what we sometimes use for modeling time series. We can use liquid networks not only for time series, but these continuous time series. And those continuous time series are closed form networks. And they compare with deep learning in terms of performance, but they avoid a lot of the constraints that are applied to comparable differential equation models. So that's where they're positioning this. And so you have a neuron with synapses, you have these connections that you want to analyze. You build a different set of differential equations to describe this. We can solve this in closed form, which is just a way of stating the equation. And then this is the way we can usually do this analytically, but we can't really simulate this very well. So this is why they're engaging in this investigation. And they give some details here of what they're doing. So they can replicate the dynamics with the CFC versus an ordinary differential equation. CFCs are continuous depth models that can set their temporal behavior based on the task under test. So they're flexible and thus expressive, which means they can be used in a lot of different applications. Okay, so that's all I'm going to talk about there. It was kind of a nice segue from Alife to some computational modeling. But I wanted to finish up today, and I guess Jesse had to leave. Let's see what he had to say. Okay, yeah, he has to drop off. He's going to check things out later. That's fine. The last thing I wanted to talk about is a follow-up to the causality discussion we had last week. And so let's go there now. Okay. So the causality, we talked about causality generally. We talked about some of the methods, the techniques. And so this week we're going to talk about causality in neuroscience specifically. or in behavior and neuroscience specifically. You know, when science Twitter is good, it usually hangs on some sort of debate. So this is a nice little debate that happened this week. So this is Earl K. Miller from MIT. He was replying to something and he said, without inference and hypothesizing about causality, what's left in neuro? Sitting around and marveling about how pretty the brain looks when it works? Proving causality is for philosophers. Our tools may not be perfect. That's why we spend our lives gradually adding evidence. So I think this was a response to something about causality. Conrad Cording is into causality quite a bit. This is a follow-up from Neuromatch, where Conrad Cording, you know, he was sort of the head person, one of the founders of Neuromatch, and he's always had a long-standing interest in causality. So this is how we got to this causality discussion. But anyway, in any case, Conrad asks the simple question, why is neuroscience so into causality? So this is actually a subtweet of this first tweet. So this is not necessarily the origins of this discussion. But in true causal form, we want to maybe understand where it comes from. But in any case, they have this discussion. And so why is neuroscience so into causality? And then Earl K. Miller, I guess, says something about why unavoidable. So why is neuroscience into causality? It's unavoidable. When you're working with data on what we usually consider to be goal-oriented tasks, it's unavoidable to talk about causality. Every time someone reports, say, spiking to, say, dots moving, so what you're doing in an experiment usually is you're testing your subject. It could be a human, it could be a non-human animal. You know, it's always the same though. You have a subject, you have a stimulus, you have a response. And you want to know what's happening inside the brain when there's a stimulus, and you want to know what's happening inside the brain when there's a response. And a lot of that is causality. You want to differentiate the thing that's causing the brain activity in response to the stimulus. You want to know what brain activity is causing in terms of the output. So, you know, you want to differentiate from, say, like random motion versus motor control, or if there was a random array of dots in front of someone, if they're picking out a pattern and processing that pattern, or if they're just responding to the random set of dots moving, you want to be able to identify those responses, different modes of response. And so that's where they're kind of why there's an interest in causality. There's another response here, kind of got cut off. I am not sure what understanding how the brain works could mean if not understanding the mechanisms of the brain, which means understanding which activity causes what to happen. Someone else asks, how does true understanding occur without causality? Then someone says causality is overrated, which is, you know, contrarian view, I guess. John Kuby says mechanisms are causality, causality is mechanisms, which is kind of circular, but if you think about it, what he's basically saying is that when we talk about mechanistic thinking, what we're really talking about is that ability to establish causality. Whereas if we're thinking about emergentist thinking, we're not really interested in causality, but maybe we are interested in causality. But it's less tied to this sort of idea of this causes that. You know, building the linear chain of causality that we talked about last week. This actually brings up an interesting point, because you have two things here. You have causality as mechanisms and causality as sort of causality. So if you don't know the mechanism, can you figure out the causality of something? Maybe. That's why we're looking for mechanisms, because we look for the sort of the ultimate cause, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. Then this person here, Gokul Rajan, says, likely arises from a healthy obsession for predictions, manipulations, and mechanistic explanations. But wait, what's cause and effect here? So you don't really know what cause and effect are in this context. So yeah, and then going back to the Earl Miller and Conrad Cording debate here, This is the thing that we talked about with the dots moving. Is there another way to think about the brain? And then Cording says, sure, descriptively, normatively, evolutionarily, developmentally. This is interesting that there are these different approaches that maybe aren't purely mechanistic. And so, and then Trevor Blackwell says, precisely because causality in neuroscience is so hard and vague, electrical engineers never need to talk about it because causality is always obvious. That actually goes back to what we were talking about with physical computation, that you have circuits that electrical engineers say work with, where the causality is very known. You have logic gates, you have the logic gates are either on or off, the causality is very simple, and you don't really say what causality is because it doesn't matter. It's imbued in your tools and your methods. And so neuroscience is not like that. We have to make methods. Some of them are more amenable to causality than others. And so this is not going to be solved in this thread. But we do have some things we can turn to. So one of those is thinking about Nico Tinbergen's 4 questions. And so I may not start with that one. I may start with the 4 questions. So Nico Tinbergen was an animal behaviorist, and he talked about the 4 questions. This is a paper from 2019 by Randolph Nesse, Evolution Medicine and Public Health Journal. Tinbergen's 4 questions, too proximate, too evolutionary. And so there's this idea about function. And so in function, you have this issue of, if I perform a behavior is a function. It's a function of physiology. It's a function of what the brain is doing, and so it performs something on the world. It interacts with the world in certain ways. So this goes back to Ernst Marr, who suggested that biology includes 2 enterprises that ask different questions. Functional biologists ask proximate questions about structures and how mechanisms work. Evolutionary biologists ask ultimate questions about why organisms are the way they are. The distinction between proximate and evolutionary explanations is a core principle of evolutionary medicine and other evolutionary approaches, but Marr's terminology has caused confusion. So Nico Tinbergen, who was an ethologist, he expanded Marr's distinction into what are now known as Tinbergen's 4 questions. He called them causation, ontogeny, which is development, evolution, and survival value. Now they are often referred to as mechanism, ontogeny, phylogeny, which is evolution, and adaptive significance. The first 2 are proximate questions. So mechanism and ontogeny or development are proximate. So they're like things that you can observe directly. You can actually observe them you can observe like development unfold, or you can observe behavior unfold in the mechanism in the brain if you want to look for it. Whereas phylogeny and adaptive significance are these things that are ultimate, or they're ways to describe why things are the way they are, but you can't necessarily observe them directly, with some exceptions. So descriptions of biochemical pathways, for example, are proximate. Describing the cost benefits and evolutionary history of the pathway are ultimate. So you have things that are proximate, you have things that are ultimate. And this is a nice table of these things. Ontogeny is how does the trait develop in individuals. Mechanism is what is the structure of that trait. That's what John Kuby was talking about with respect to mechanism. Phylogeny is what is the trait's evolutionary history. And adaptive significance is how has trait variation influenced fitness, which is a measure of, it's a measure that originates from proximate observations, but it's has relevance to this ultimate explanation. So that's what sort of Nico Tinbergen brings to the discussion. Now, he was also interested in questions of instinct, and so he characterized the biological study of behavior or ethology as having these 4 kinds of questions: causation, ontogeny, adaptive function, and phylotic evolution. So this is, again, restating this. Now, he said that science should give equal attention to each, and that their integration is important. And this is, of course, in the study of instinct. So Tinbergen was interested in instinctual behaviors, which is maybe different from what some neuroscientists are interested in, which is cognition, which is other types of behaviors that aren't necessarily instinctual. But nevertheless, I think that you can have this framework. It may or may not work well. There have been some attempts to incorporate it into mainstream neuroscience. Now, there are some criticisms, of course. The assumption of innateness and the lack of physiological credibility of the instinct model has been met with adverse criticism, which Tinbergen conceded to a large extent. So, there's not everything is innate. And, there's some problems with thinking about physiological systems in this way. So these are flaws to this kind of model of the 4 questions framing. But his later work concentrated on functional issues, which anticipated the direction dominating subsequent ethological studies. So, this is not necessarily a silver bullet for our concerns about causality, but it is a way to kind of frame some of these issues. Then there's this paper, Causality and Thought. This is more of a cognitive science view of things. And so this kind of gets us into causal knowledge and causal reasoning and causal attribution. So this is kind of a meta thing where we're thinking about causality in human cognition and, how it sort of plays a role in thought. So, maybe, some of these questions are about our own cognition, how we think about things as being causal versus not causal. So the abstract reads, causal knowledge plays a crucial role in human thought, but the nature of causal representation and inference remains a puzzle. Can human causal inference be captured by relations of probabilistic dependency, or does it draw on richer forms of representation? This article explores this question by reviewing research and reasoning, decision-making, various forms of judgment, and attribution. So they endorse causal Bayesian networks as the best normative framework and as a productive guide to theory building. So we talked about Bayesian networks last time when we talked about one of the tools for understanding causality. However, it is an incomplete account of causal thinking. So we can use Bayesian networks, and we can learn a lot from those tools, but they don't necessarily give us the entire account. On the basis of a range of experimental work, we identify 3 hallmarks of causal reasoning: the role of mechanism, which we talked about, narrative, and mental simulation. And so these 2 weren't talked about in that debate, but these are, sort of corollaries to mechanism. When you're dealing with physiology, as we mentioned, that's a proximate explanation. So maybe we're interested in causality in terms of mechanism and neuroscience, in maybe like cellular neuroscience or behavioral neuroscience. But in cognitive science, you might be interested in narrative and mental simulation. And these are things that are more sort of like finding causality in thought rather than in the brain. But still, it's causal. You have to use tools that, causal tools should be generalizable. All of which go beyond mere probabilistic knowledge. So they contrast causality here with probabilistic knowledge. So instead of just basically saying, something's going to occur with a certain probability, and this is how I link one thing with another. If one thing occurs with something else probabilistically, then I'm going to say that they're associated. But of course, as we mentioned before, that's correlation, not necessarily causation. We need to use things like Bayesian networks, but they're not enough, and we need to figure out maybe a little bit more of a rigorous tool that can sort of overcome the shortcomings of Bayesian networks. We propose that the hallmarks are closely related. Mental simulations are representations over time of mechanisms. So mental simulations allow you to think through mechanisms and how they're related, and gives you like a deeper understanding. Now, mental simulations could be replaced by computer simulations or artificial life simulations or artificial something simulation, some sort of simulation could allow you to simulate these mechanisms so that you can see how it plays out in different ways and give you different counterfactuals, as we talked about last week. When multiple actors are involved, these simulations are aggregated into narratives. So that's their argument here, and they have a lot of work that they've done, a lot of different caveats here: asymmetry of cause and effect, illusion of explanatory depth, Markov violations. These are all things that are sort of caveats to the Bayesian model and so forth. So the final paper then is this functional neuroconnectomics. So this is where we get into connectomes, where we need to figure out how things are related in connectomes, where you have these networks that are all interconnected and basically products of correlations or interactions. And so figuring out causality in a system like that is very hard. So figuring out what the causal functional connectome looks like is hard. You can get these connections that are things that are associated during maybe a task, or maybe are wired together in some way. But to figure out how the function emerges from that, what is the cause? If one thing causes another in the brain, how do we observe that, and how do we determine and confirm that? So such representations incorporates the dynamic nature of neural activity and causal interactions between them. So in contrast to the connectome, the causal functional connectome, which is a construct that they're deriving from the connectome, is not directly observable and needs to be inferred from neural time series. So this isn't necessarily a proximate explanation. This is somewhere in between proximate and ultimate. But it's not ultimate because, while we can't directly observe it, we need to sort of infer it from a time series. It's sort of maybe like your phylogenetic level of explanation, or maybe your survival imperative, but it's not quite that. A popular statistical framework for inferring causal connectivity from observations is directed probabilistic graphical modeling, which we talked about last time. Its common formulation is not suitable for neural time series, so we can't use this tool because it was developed for variables with independent and identically distributed static samples. In other words, probabilistic graphical modeling is for these kind of IID variables to be associated. So they're independent, but they're observed and they're discrete observations. And so that affects how they're connected and how you can make an inference. With time series, you can't necessarily use this model because time series vary with each other. So if you connect one time series to another time series, you have to deal with like a lot of fluctuations and how in phase the signals are and things like that. So we can't use that method. So in this work, we propose to model and estimate the causal functional connectivity from neural time series, using a novel approach that adapts directed probabilistic graphical modeling, so they're adapting this method to the time series scenario. In particular, we developed the time-aware PC algorithm, which is this TPC algorithm, for estimating the causal functional connectivity, which adapts the PC algorithm, a state-of-the-art method for statistical causal inference. We show that the model outcome of TPC has the properties of reflecting causality of neural interactions, such as being non-parametric, exhibits the directed Markov property. So they point out that Markov models are generally not directed. They're usually, sort of these random variables that don't have a directionality. But in this case, they're directed Markov properties in a time series setting. So they modify the model in that way, and is predictive of the consequence of counterfactual interventions on the time series. So you're able to make counterfactual interventions on a time series, and this is the way they're approaching causality and counterfactuals. We demonstrate the utility of the methodology to obtain the causal functional connectome for several datasets, including simulations, benchmark data sets, and recent multi-array electrophysiological recordings from the mouse visual cortex. And so that's our discussion on causality. I think that was good because it kind of went over some specific things specific to neuroscience, but it also brought up a lot of things like the 4 questions, which point out that causality happens at different levels. You can have proximate sort of observations, and you need to determine causality from that. But you also have these ultimate or near ultimate explanations that require you to do inference, require you to do other things to get to that sort of determining causality there. And they're much different. They're not the same. And they require different types of tools. So the tools we have are incomplete. We need better tools for this enterprise. But we also need more theory, I think. We need to think about causality more deeply in terms of, what is causality? What are the tools we use appropriate? How are they inappropriate? And then there are things like retrocausality, which you find in physics. And that's something else that we won't even get into. We may get into it maybe next week, but that's a different kettle of fish, as they say. And so I think the takeaway here so far is that causality is worth kind of talking about, but also there's a lot of opportunity for thinking about how to characterize it. That's all I have for today. I hope to see you around the Slack and Discord, and talk to you next week.